me today. Welcome to the State of the Dunes mini conference and Dune management workshop. It's inspired by many of you, both in person and online. So while I'm talking, it's a community meeting. So thank you so much. We have a lot of different sponsors who helped have this come together. Some federal partners. The sponsors listed here are OSU, the U.S. Coast Research Program, Oregon Sea Grant, NSF HOPE Program, the National Center for Coastal and Ocean Science from NOAA, and the Oregon Wildlife Foundation, as well as the Agricultural Research Foundation. So thank you to all of them. Okay, I also wanted to give a special thanks to our federal partners, DLCD, OPRD, U.S. Forest Service, and the USDA. Thank you so much for coming and participating and giving us the ideas for the topics we're going to talk about today. And special thanks to Flax and Conway, who's over here in the corner. Virgos, who's online. There is our interns and students. Flax is going to help everyone keep time, so make sure you pay attention to Flaxen as you're talking, both during the plenary talks at the beginning and lightning talk. And then also another special thanks to Carly Ringer and Lisa Asprue, who are two graduate students at OSU who really helped plan this workshop. All right, Carly. So this is our morning sessions. We have the plenary talks first. We'll have a science talk and then a management science synthesis and then a management synthesis, and then we'll go into the lightning talk. So we'll have a couple minutes for questions after each plenary talk, and then just a couple minutes after each lightning talk as well. All right, so our first speaker is Sally Hacker, Peter Ruggiero, and Steve Dundas from OSU.
Thanks, Megan, for organizing. So today what I want to do is start out the talk by giving you a little bit of an idea of kind of the natural history of dunes here in Pacific Northwest. And the title of our talk is Optimizing Ecosystem Services in the Face of Shifting Coast Markets. And my name is Sally Hacker. I'm a professor in integrative biology, and we're going to have, I'm going to talk first about kind of the natural history and kind of set the stage for Peter Ruggiero, who's going to come next. So Peter is also from OSU. We've been collaborating for a number of years. Peter will talk more specifically about how to measure some of the ecosystems that we can consider. And then Steve Dundas is going to finish us up. Applied economist at OSU and also a collaborator of ours. He will talk more about the economic value of dunes here. So as you probably know, beaches and dunes make up about 45% of the Oregon and Washington coastlines. So they're very, very common ecosystems. And the largest dune sheet in North America is here. Very special kind of dune system here in the Pacific. And prior to 1900, the coastal dunes of the Pacific was sparsely vegetated. We had a very open, shifting sand environment, and there were a lot of native plants, a lot of native plant species that are shown here in this slide, and they also a lot of native animals. And so in the early 1900s, the non-native beach grasses were systematically planted across the Pacific coast to stabilize the shifting sand environment. And that stabilization happened through this biophysical feedback between the vegetation that was planted, so these non-native beach grasses, and the sand that was making its way to the beach. And what
what this did was actually create very large foredunes. So these hills of sand in front of the dune or in back of the beach, if you will. And this led to a coast-wide level transformation of dunes in the Pacific Northwest and actually along the Pacific, in the entire Pacific coastline. Here's a picture of Pacific City, Oregon in 1930, and you can see a lot of sand, open sand environments, open beach environments. And then a picture down below in 2012, you can see lots of green, lots of vegetation. There's foredunes that are formed, and there's a lot of development behind the dune on those in that system. There's a picture there of Umpqua Dunes in Oregon. You can see the foredune outlined in the back of the beach, and then behind that are these deflation plains. These deflation plains ecosystems were entirely created by the fact that foredunes were present and formed from the planting of beach grasses. And there wasn't just one species of beach grass planted, there were actually two species. So the first beach grass that was planted is the European beach grass, or Ammophila arenaria. And it was the first one introduced in the early 1900s, and it spread up and down the Pacific coast from Baja all the way up to Canada. So we have Ammophila arenaria up into Alaska, in fact. And then American beach grass was planted secondarily near the Columbia River in the 1930s. And it subsequently spread and dominated mostly the northern dunes. So the northern Oregon to southern Washington dune systems are mostly dominated by this American beach grass species, which is from the east coast of the US. So both of these species are non-native. And research that we've done over the years has shown that because of the differences in terms of the growth form of these two different species, they actually create different shaped dunes. So they provide different kind of morphologies of foredunes. So the European beach grass grows dunes about twice as tall as the American beach grass. It has a vertical growth form. And so it, through this sort of vertical growth form, is able to capture sand and create taller dunes compared to the American beach grass, which is a more lateral growth form, creates shorter and wider dunes. And work that we've done shows that these grasses can make a difference in dune morphology, but keep in mind that sand supply is a really key part of this as well. So that's this feedback between the beach grasses that's important. So what do foredunes do? Why do we care about the fact that we now have these very large foredunes? Well, they can obviously capture sand and stabilize that sand. They can serve as barriers from extreme storm events, sea level rise, maybe even tsunamis. And they can prevent beach erosion, especially compared to installing hard structures or gray infrastructure, which can erode beaches. So by providing this sort of natural-based kind of barrier, it promotes recreation, beach recreation. They also can increase carbon sequestration. So we're working on, you'll hear a talk today about the carbon that's actually sequestered in these dunes because of this planting of beach grasses so many decades ago. Foredunes can also affect biodiversity and aesthetics. So they can cause the decline of native species, including Western snowy plover. They can increase the invasion of other non-native plant species, including Scotch broom and gorse. And obviously they can allow development in historically hazardous coastal areas. And they may now interfere with view sheds. So some dunes are so large that the people that are living behind them don't have their view shed anymore. So management then has to sort of balance these trade-offs between, for example, restoring dunes back to what they were to conserve biodiversity, versus coastal protection and carbon storage, or dune grading for view sheds versus coastal protection and carbon storage, or beach accessibility versus installing gray infrastructure for coastal protection. So given these trade-offs, our focus, our research is really focused on coastal planning to optimize the ecosystem services that are presented across this landscape or coastscape. So what Peter will talk about next is how do we determine the biophysical and economic value of a suite of coastal ecosystem services relevant to beaches and dunes here in the Pacific Northwest. And then Steve's going to pick up and talk about integrating some biophysical and economic data into land use models and how we do that and engage coastal communities in co-developing some kind of optimal policy scenarios for that. So Peter, why don't you come up and continue on?
Thank you, Sally. Yeah, so as Sally said, we're aiming to quantify the biophysical and economic values of a suite of coastal protection services. So I think, this list, look behind me, but the screens are all over there. But Sally mentioned the majority of these: coastal protection, recreation, beach accessibility, biodiversity conservation, carbon sequestration, and viewshed. And then there's a variety of approaches that we've been using to try to quantify these. And so I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of how we've first attempted the biophysical quantification, and Steve will get into some of the details of the economic valuation. Okay, so this is plain. So I think one of the most obvious things from a coastal dune perspective in terms of some of the ecosystem services is coastal protection. And so just very simply, it's the height of the dune, the volume of sand trapped in that sand dune provides the protection against events like this where we're seeing some overtopping. And so we need to actually be able to develop some, ideally some simple proxies for how often, say, this kind of thing happens where the waves get over the protecting foredune and impacts backshore infrastructure. And we know that, we've got today's climate, wave and water level climate, but we also know that we have a lot of sea level rise projections, a lot of uncertainty out into the future. So we can actually figure out ways to quantify this. It'll help us in terms of thinking about policy and going forward. So to do that, we have to kind of take a step back and first just quantify the dunes themselves. And so we've been doing this with different data sets for a couple of decades now. Luckily, we have a variety of different mechanisms to actually measure dunes, but one of the best ways to get great spatial coverage is with airborne LiDAR data sets. And so I just had a master's student that worked in my research group, Jake Light, who finished his master's in December, and he actually quantified the coastal dunes for the entire state of Oregon and from a 2016 data set. And we had previously done this for 2002. And so now we have the ability to quantify metrics like you're seeing on the screen here in terms of the shoreline position, the dune toe position and elevation, beach slopes, the crest of the dune. It tells us again how high the water level needs to be to impact backshore infrastructure. And so this is just an example of the Rockaway Beach littoral cell in Tillamook County, showing the longshore variability of the elevation of the dune toe, the elevation of the crest of the dune, and then the volume of sediment contained in that. And so again, we've collected these data sets throughout all of Oregon. And the nice thing now is that because we did this for a 2002 data set, we're actually able to calculate change. So again, this is just an example for one of the littoral cells in Oregon where we're quantifying these parameters. In this case, shows a little bit of seaward progradation of the dune toe and some variability in terms of the volume. And so this data set is now available, and there's actually a myriad of uses for this kind of data. So if anybody's interested, definitely feel free to get in touch with me, and we'll make this available for folks. But it allows us to, as I said, quantify the evolution of the coastal dunes. So something about the sediment budgets. We're also quantifying historical shoreline change now up through 2016. The previous kind of shoreline change data sets that we had for the state of Oregon kind of ended in 2002. So now we have a comprehensive data set through 2016. We're not going to talk about this a ton in this meeting today, I don't think, but you can imagine one of the things we're also trying to do is generate forecasts of future shoreline locations, so modeling how we think shorelines might evolve as well as how dunes might evolve. And so I think we might touch on it here and there, but these data sets are kind of fundamental to be able to make these projections about what the future might hold. So we've got the dune morphometrics, what's the sediment that's trapped in the dunes themselves. We also now need to say something about the water levels and waves that basically lead to the water, that kind of storm-induced water level that you saw in that video. And so we've developed a technique that basically allows us to quantify the interannual variability. So whether we're in an El Nino event or a La Nina like this past year, seasonal variability, incorporate things like astronomical tides and sea level rise projections, and make projections of what the water level variability. So that's what all those time series are meant to show. And then that combined with the dune morphometrics, we're able to quantify basically the time evolution now of a couple of simple proxies for how often we might expect dune erosion. So that's the dune erosion proxy that I'm showing with that little sketch. So how often waves are banging into dunes, how often they're getting overtopped, and then something about beach safety and accessibility. How often we actually have a wide usable beach for people to actually walk along the beach. And so a student that's not here today, Meredith Leong, is now quantifying those metrics with this water level model, as well as the dune information that we have for the entire state of Oregon. So everywhere we have dunes, and this is just an example for part of the northern coast. So we're actually able to quantify the percentage of time, in this case, that we're in this, what we call the collision regime. So that's how often waves are banging against the toe of the dune, and then really seeing how that's going to change in the future under different sea level rise scenarios. So the three right-hand panels are basically the evolution of that simple proxy. So it gives us a sense under different uncertain future scenarios where we might have hotspots of increased dune erosion, dune overtopping, and unsafe locations in our beaches. So that's just a simple example of how we're quantifying the biophysical services, and I'll let Steve take over now and talk about some of the economic valuation.
All right, thanks, Peter. All right, so we've talked about the ecological components and kind of the biophysical components about the ecosystem services that are provided by dunes. And my job here is to talk to you a little bit about the economic value provided by these dunes. So services provided by these dunes can have economic value depending on how much people value them through recreation, housing choice, and other metrics. We can take these measures and put them into a quantitative money metric that is helpful for us to think about in terms of policy change. So if you think about policies, they usually cost money. So what do you get for your policy? In order to do that on a apples to apples comparison, it's good to have those quantitative kind of dollar metrics for the benefits that might arise from a different policy change. And there are multiple kind of empirical data-driven approaches that we can use to estimate these values. The first one is called revealed preferences. Here we can use observed data on people's recreation choices and choices of their housing location and how much they're willing to pay for those houses. So people reveal their preferences for different aspects of the landscape in this particular method. However, there's a lot of things about dunes like habitat and habitat quality and endangered species that don't have these kind of market transactions where people can reveal their behavior and reveal their preferences. So as an environmental economist, what we do is we ask people, we create hypothetical surveys where people will state their preference for different changes in environmental quality that might occur. So the reveal preference approach that we use is housing markets. We estimate how features of the beach and dune landscape capitalize on a nearby housing value. So if you think about buying a house, you care about the number of bedrooms, the number of bathrooms, your square footage, does it have air conditioning, things like that, but you also care about things that are around you. And in coastal housing markets, the beach is one of those things that's around you, and the dunes have different features that could translate into how much people are willing to pay for a home. So some examples of the things that Peter's group has measured that we can use in these housing market models include beach width, dune width, height, and volume, presence of dune grasses and view shed. So we can tease out the different components of a housing market and see how people participating in the market value these different services by beaches. And just to give you an example, in these pictures, these are 3 different dunes that have houses behind them in Oregon. The one in the upper left, it's very sparsely vegetated, just kind of flowing, shifting sands. If you're thinking about buying a house in that particular location, like you might observe, hey, there's a lot of shifting sand, not much vegetation that might affect whether you choose to buy a house there or how much you're willing to pay for it. On the lower left, it's up in Clatsop, just above Seaside, I believe. The dune system is much larger. You might think, hey, if I'm going to buy a house there, I'm going to be pretty well protected. Maybe I'm not thrilled that I have to walk a long way to get to the beach, but at least I know I don't have to worry about the winter storms. And the one on the right is kind of somewhere in between, where it's a little bit smaller dune, but it is vegetated. You might have some protection. But the variation in the dune types along the Oregon coast allow us to identify these different values, people, place, and housing market for different types of characteristics of these dunes. In the second approach, is stated preference approach. We've implemented 2 surveys in the last few years in Oregon. The first was estimating using illustrations to show what restoring a dune landscape to what it had been prior to beach grass invasion and how people might value that change. And that was completed in 2019. And another survey that's finishing fielding today is looking at safe beach access on developed shorelines to understand how much they'd be willing to pay to maintain safe beach access given sea level rise and other potential changes to the shoreline. And when I mentioned stated preference approaches, just to give you an idea, these are kind of what the questions that we ask look like. The one on the left is from the habitat survey, where we compare a status quo on the far right in the pink column versus 2 alternatives that would change characteristics of dunes from different types of restoration, the size, and the type of activities that were allowed. We can use people's observed choices in this hypothetical scenario to back out how much they're willing to pay for different aspects of dune restoration. The survey on the right is the one that's currently in the field now, looking at change in safe hours and more of a referendum style question. So when we don't have markets where we can observe these revealed behaviors, we have to create markets and ask them. Sally had mentioned carbon storage. That's another component that we're also trying to value that we can all we need here is we need an understanding of how much carbon can be stored in these dunes, and then we can use what's called the social cost of carbon, or the value of keeping 1 ton of carbon from the atmosphere is measured by how much damage that additional ton of carbon would do. And right now, the current working social cost of carbon is somewhere between $42 and $80, depending on different types of assumptions you might make. We can take that volume and that dollar amount and begin to understand how much value of carbon sequestration is in Oregon's dunes. Taking all this together, our goal is to kind of integrate these different disciplines and this different knowledge set about Oregon's dunes and figure out how we can think about future management given the threats of sea level rise and climate change. And so here, this kind of shows you a schematic of how we're thinking about this with ecosystem services leading to biophysical production and economic values that generate from those services, and then leading into different stakeholder engagement and modeling scenarios and climate scenarios where we can think about how shifting these landscapes can change both the biophysical and economic values so that we can figure out how to better manage our coastlines to provide the most value to Oregonians. And as I'm out of time, last thing to do is just to note all the graduate students and agency partners that have been helping us work on this project over the last few years. Thank you.
Any questions for Sally, Peter, Steve?
I'm just gonna change. So
We're talking about the ways that you measure water levels. And what we experienced this year is there suddenly low pressure. And suddenly we're
Yeah, we're definitely trying to sort of things.
Peter, could you come up here and answer?
Yep.
It doesn't work for us.
Okay. Yeah, the question was in the water level modeling that I spoke of, are we including low pressure events and the storm surge that is basically accompanying that? And the answer is yes. We have mechanisms to kind of decompose the tide gauge record into its constitutive components, and storm surge is one of those, a non-tidal component that's actually measured by tide gauges. And then when we do the modeling going forward, we do incorporate that. You know, one of the cool things is that even though we have maybe a couple, several decades worth of tide gauge records, it's still not all the combinations of waves and water levels and low pressure events that we can potentially get And so that's why we want to develop these modeling techniques to really kind of go do this in a probabilistic sense, to get all those combinations to potentially really assess the worst case scenario.
Any questions here? Got more time, don't be shy. That was fast, that was good.
I think there was a question somewhere. Oh,
Yeah, I was just wondering about the next step.
so the question was, what are the next steps? And so anyone who wants to answer should come up here.
Well, I think, you know, Steve's schematic at the end was sort of where we're going right now. We have we're calling that the where to put things model, and Steve and Emma are kind of leading that exercise and trying to think through, are there different ways to kind of shuffle the way things are managed on the Oregon, you know, kind of a virtual Oregon coast right now, such that we actually increase the overall ecosystem services, right? So as Steve mentioned, you know, to improve, you know, the services we're getting for all Oregonians. And so there's a variety of ways we're doing that. We're doing that kind of as a desktop exercise. I think the slide that Steve showed also mentioned a model called Envision, which is a way we could do things in a very spatially explicit way. We're kind of working towards that as well. So there's a variety of different ways we're trying to model different policy implementations along the Oregon coast. And then with these tools that Steve and I briefly mentioned, can we actually quantify this suite of ecosystem services and see which combination of policies actually lead to the best result? So I think that's mostly where we're going for this. Besides all the, can we actually even just model coastal evolution and forward Dune evolution? That's hard as well.
Okay. Well, thank you to the 3 speakers so far. So our next talk is from Meg Reed and Kevin Herkamp. Is that how I say it correctly? So you just use the mouse, and this is the microphone for Zoom.
Thank you. You should stand over there because you're tall and I'll be covered up. Hi, everyone. I'm Meg Reed. I'm the Coastal Shore Specialist with the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development. This is Kevin. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Kevin Herkamp. I'm the new Ocean Shores Coordinator with the Oregon Park and Recreation Department.
So we're gonna, Kevin's new. He just started in April, right?
2 months. I
Yeah,
just hit my 2 month like tomorrow.
So we're really putting him on the spot here. But we're going to talk a little bit today more about the policy and management side of Oregon's coastal dunes, sort of the history of how they came about, and kind of try to point out some of the challenges we have, which will help tee us up for our discussions later this afternoon. So let's see if I could do this. I have to use my other hand. There we go. So just to set the stage a little bit, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, or DLCD, also implements Oregon's Coastal Zone Management Program, which is a federally approved program. Most of our coastal states and territories in the United States have one, except for Alaska. It's a voluntary program, and it's a partnership with the federal government and states, so that there are some sort of overarching criteria that the states have to manage to around, like non-source point solution or non-point source pollution, water quality, that kind of thing. And then in return, the states get a lot of flexibility with coastal zone management and get money, which is really great. So most of our program is federally funded. And Oregon's coastal zone is pretty large. It's that map that you see on the slides. It's the dark green area all the way out to the dark blue area. So that's roughly the crest of the Coast Range out to the edge of our territorial sea, which is 3 nautical miles from the coast. And that's watershed based. So it's a pretty large area. And that means every city and county within that zone has to comply with our coastal zone management program, as well as all the state agencies that have permitting authority or regulatory authority in that zone. We also have 22 major estuaries, 362 miles plus of coastline, and lots of different types of ecosystems within that, as you can sort of see in those pictures. And we've already seen from the previous presentation that we have different types of coastlines. So that's sort of, it's the overarching program that helps to manage our coastal resources. And the way that we do it at DLCD is through land use planning. So you might be familiar, we have 19 statewide planning goals that kind of encompass the whole range of land use planning, from citizen involvement, urban and rural management of growth. We have transportation goals and farm and forest goals. And then the last 4 are coastal resource specific. Those are listed on the screen here. And goal is a bit of a misnomer. They are rules that are codified in statute. So all cities and counties, as well as state agencies, have to comply with these rules. And the one that I'm the expert on for the agency is goal 18, beaches and dunes, and that's really what we're talking about today. So that's the one I'll be focusing on. But all of these coastal goals sort of help our local jurisdictions really implement the program on the ground and really do coastal zone management. So those are the tools that we have to work with. So statewide planning goal 18 is really about guiding that tension between the appropriate development of these areas, as well as the protection of the important ecosystem services that they provide that we just learned about. So it has a few main provisions that come up the most for local governments. One is they have to have an inventory of beaches and dunes. So they have to actually say, like, where are the deflation plains? Where are the foredunes that Sally was just talking about? And the inventory that most jurisdictions use is from 1975. It's extremely outdated and it's really poor data. It's a line drawn on a map. It's not GIS based, so it's really hard to zoom in. The lines are really thick. So our agency just got funding to update that this coming year. We're so very excited about that. We did a pilot project in Tillamook County and they just adopted that new inventory. So that's really exciting. But then the other main policies are that we prohibit development in any areas of dune landform that are subject to ocean flooding. And that's commercial, industrial, and residential structures are just outright prohibited in those areas. Limited other development is allowed if it meets certain other circumstances. So think like beach walkways or beachfront protective structures, that kind of thing. That is the next main provision about shoreline armoring. So beachfront protective structures like riprap and seawalls are only allowed to be developed, placed on property that was developed as of January 1st, 1977. So it's a grandfathering clause that basically says no more armoring, except for these properties that were already developed because of property rights, so we couldn't do takings. And then the last one, which is really probably the most relevant to this workshop today, is about dune grading requirements. That's where, like Sally was talking about, view sheds. People who want to lower the height of their dunes to be able to see the ocean. In the beginning, when our goals were first put out in the 1970s, that was actually outright prohibited, but then the homeowners were doing it illegally. So our commission came up with a set of requirements that you would still be allowed to do that, but under a very prescribed set of circumstances. And so I'll talk about those on this next slide. It's really, so this is something I like to emphasize with all our local governments, is that view grading is optional. They can allow it, but they do not have to. And what it's only allowed as part of an approved foredune management plan. So they have to have an entire plan that talks about the entire foredune system and the area subject to accretion. It has to specify a minimum dune height and width requirements for actually doing the grading. In the goal, it specifies you can't go any lower than the base flood elevation plus 4 feet. And those are set by the FEMA flood maps. And then you have to identify areas to build up. So like low spots that where the extra sand would go. You have to stabilize the dune post grading with grasses or some type of vegetation. We don't specify which type, it's up to the homeowners. And it prohibits the removal of sand from the beach dune system. So you can't just truck sand away, it has to stay in the beach. So those were sort of the compromised approach that our commission came up with in 1984 to allow this to still happen. And there are 3 pieces to a management plan. You have to have a scientific background report, a management strategy, and then a maintenance and monitoring plan, which is usually the part that gets forgotten about and is least productive. These can be really difficult to update and are rarely updated. So it's really, that's one of our biggest challenges, is actually just having homeowners coordinate together and update these plans because most of them are out of date. This next slide, you can see we have 6 foredune management plans in Oregon. They're all on the the central or northern Oregon coast, which makes sense because that's where most people are living on the oceanfront. The most recent one was Cannon Beach. They just updated their plan in 2020, and they actually prohibit view grading now. And then Seaside is going through an update right now. And then before that, but Bayshore is the most recent one after that, which is the Alcee Spit. That was in 2012. And so before I turn it over to Kevin to talk more about the permitting side of thing, I just wanted to also mention that there is a difference between view grading and remedial grading. So those top pictures are view grading, and the bottom pictures are what would be remedial grading. So you don't need a 4D management plan to do remedial grading. That's where sand is actually inundating a structure and causing damage to property. So usually a local government still has a permit for that, and there's a specified width that you're allowed to go out from the foundation of the house. But the really important thing with remedial grading is you're not allowed to touch the foredune at all. You have to take the sand out from around the house and then bring it up and over the dune back onto the beach. And so usually you have to get a permit from state parks to do a drive on beach permit to put that sand back back on the beach. And then a local permit, like I said, from the local government for the actual remedial grading. So I'll turn over to Kevin, and then we'll bounce back for one more slide.
All right. So the Oregon's beaches are kind of unique in that they're protected for the public in the public's in the public trust, and that happened kind of through a series of events since around 1913 when the beaches were actually dedicated to state highways. They're part of the state highway system. In the late 40s, they were turned over in a state recreation area, and then as that got challenged with further development, the beach bill came about in the late 60s, where basically the beach bill said, hey, we're going to take and put in public trust an area from what's called, I'll get to, from an area from the upland side down to low water line, and it's going to be in the public trust, allow the public to, part of it's in state ownership, part of it's actually in an easement that went over the previous property ownership. And that all came out of kind of one of the picture there, basically one of the hotels on the coast decided that they would block off the beach and say, we're going to effectively put guards up and restrict you from using this because our paying guests get this part of the beach. And that's not what the state wanted. And so after a long fight, we got into the beach bill, and really it looks at the broad encompassing protection of the coast from the recreation, scenic, and natural resource values that are out there. So the jurisdictional line is probably the more confusing piece. I'm going to go through a couple of slides just to help explain that. We can go into more detail, but when it was established, the statutory vegetation line was actually surveyed out and marked on the coast. And it went from the extreme low tide up to that statutory line, or the line of established upland vegetation, which can change over time. So as this photo is showing, there's those two lines. Well, if it can actually move inland or seaward as the dunes move. And so we really have a couple of different scenarios on there. And this first one's the most common, where the statutory vegetation line is actually further west. But our line of jurisdiction is actually to the east, where the actual vegetation or the established line of upland vegetation is. And that is a little bit confusing for a lot of the property owners, because they'll look on the tax map and it says, oh, well, that's right here. Or they'll look on our lines, but it's actually further up. And a lot of times that's that forefront, the portion of the foredune is actually in our jurisdiction. And then we have the other one where the dunes have accreted westward. The actual vegetation line is now farther to the west. Our jurisdiction doesn't change from back where it was when it was established under the beach bill. And so this one again becomes pretty confusing because, hey, we've got all this extra land. I bought oceanfront property 50 years ago. Well, now it's way out here. So, right, I get to manage that land. No, it's actually in the State Parks Trust, and we manage that. So as far as we have all sorts of permits within that statutory vegetation line or line of established vegetation. I mean, we mentioned some of the protective structures, the grading, development of anything like beach access ways, pipelines, boring of cables or conduits, but even things like driving on the beach, those kind of activities are in our scope of review. And here's just some photos of a few different things that are out there on the coast. We've talked about one of the more controversial and probably more extensive pieces related to this is a lot of the armoring that's going on. And there's a big interest right now in some of our dunal communities to basically armor everything. And then We have a lot of legacy structures and a lot of unpermitted stuff that's out there that we're going to be trying to take a look at over time, because those compound both the processes on the beach, but also public access. And then, as I mentioned, driving on the beach, there's different ways that you can get on the beach. Several parts are open for driving, then other parts are restricted for driving on it. Those ones that are restricted, we have a permitting process to come in to actually get authorization to do those activities. Let's see, and in the dune, we get engaged with the restoration of them, dune grading, as Meg mentioned, with the view grading. Some of that work may actually be outside of our jurisdiction, but either the disposal of the sand or even some of the coastal side, the westward side of that dune grading was probably within our jurisdiction. Dune restoration activities, mowing. You saw the photos of Gearhart, where you've got this large coastal dune. A lot of that's actually our land. The residents love to mow it and have been doing it for decades. Don't know why, but haven't had permits to do it, have been doing it. Brush removal, as you can see in the bottom left there, people, they buy their coastal property and say, "Hey, great, we want to go in and remove all the brush so we can see the ocean." Well, there's a lot of issues with that. And then signage, a lot of times folks don't realize it, but if you're putting signage or anything of that nature actually in our jurisdictional area, we actually have to permit that as well. The process for our permits, there has to be a demonstrated need for the project, but then we also need to compare that with the benefit to the public of either doing it or not doing the project. And that includes an alternatives analysis and looking at those impacts throughout the resource values that are out there, whether it's scenic or natural resource value, but recreation is a big one on a lot of these, and public safety. Permit process itself can take about 30 to, we'll say 130 days or so, in that, depending on the nuances in there. So I think it's back to you.
So just wanted to end by just kind of sharing a couple of dune grading challenges that both our agencies experience, as well as all the local governments. Because we're asking people to do for dune management on an area-wide basis, that means multiple houses and homeowners have to coordinate together, and that can be really challenging because most of these are second homes or vacation rentals. So there are people who are living out of the area, and so it can be really hard to just communicate and get them all on board, because you do have to have 100% of the property owners agreeing to it, and they have to sign off on it. There are permit fees for every person, and so that's certainly a problem. And then just like Kevin was mentioned, people kind of don't necessarily know the rules, and they're not necessarily trying to do anything wrong, but they're still doing things that are a violation of the ocean shore and their property. So that can be a really big problem. Just stabilizing the dunes and destabilizing the dunes. So people will plant, but they don't really like the plants because they think it blocks their view over time. And so they actually will actively put pesticides on it and kill the dune grass or rip it up. And that's a violation of the ocean shore, obviously. And so those kinds of things can be just really challenging, as well as just dealing with FEMA flood requirements, funding the plan updates, and of course, accounting for future conditions, because none of them do at this point. So those are just some of the challenges. And before wrapping up, just wanted to say that, it's really clear that, at least from the human development side of things, dunes are exceptionally important. And so protecting what we already have and not messing with it is really is the best way to have coastal resilience, to protect that development. And you can see in this picture in Pacific City, the areas that were developed before the goal went into effect are in the foredune, and they deal with sand inundation and erosion problems all the time, whereas the development to the north that is behind a dune, after the goal went into effect, it's protected by the stabilizing effect of that dune that's vegetated. So you can really see the stark difference between developments that happened before and after the goal was put into place. So that's it. Thank you.
Questions for Meg and Kevin?
Just clarify, you require planting after dune grading?
Yes.
And are the specs for what a planting looks like something that you all dictate?
It is in the plan. It's in the for dune management plan that gets approved. The planting specifications are outlined in that. Yeah.
And does that tend to be?
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yep. And we have no problem with it not being something else, but it's been historically really difficult to do native plants because there's no place to buy them. for homeowners who are trying to do it. And then they are really hard to maintain. They take more fertilizer and watering, and people don't want to deal with it as it is. So, and they usually have the root system already from the grass, you know, like in Cannon Beach or Seaside or something like that, where the grasses have already been established, so it's easier for them to just re-establish. So we've had a lot of, it seems that people who want to try to do native dune plants are unsuccessful with this particular part of it.
So I know, sometimes, you know, they have a new regulation saying you cannot put it on people.
Yeah.
So that's probably not.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be a huge problem, I think, a challenge for the future. I mean, generally, they don't need an Army Corps permit, and people try really hard to not have to get an Army Corps permit because they're so difficult. But you only have to get it if you're going to go into the tide line. And there was one recently in Manzanita because they just had such huge dunes at this point that they have to put the excess sand in the high tide line, but they got denied on multiple fronts. I mean, they got denied at their OPRD permit, and they got denied the Army Corps. So, yeah.
When you mentioned funding the plan phase is an issue, where is that with the homeowners themselves?
Yes. Yeah, and the city can help too, and they have in the past. Our agency did help fund all of them basically in the beginning, but generally we're pretty against it at this point because it's really just helping a few people, and we don't really want people to be messing with the dunes anyway. So we're not going to fund them, but it would be up to the homeowners in the cities to do it themselves.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so now we're starting our round of lightning talks, and each talk is 5 minutes. We're going to go in the order that is on the agenda on your table. So Laurel, you're up first. Okay, so you just can use up and down or the mouse, and then that's the speaker or the mic.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'll watch you flexing. Okay, good deal. Sorry, Meg, I'm going to talk about messing with it. Yeah, messing with the dunes, putting them back the way they were. Hi, everybody. My name's Laurel Hillman. I work for Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. I'm Ocean Shore Resource Coordinator Specialist. One of my responsibilities is helping to coordinate the habitat conservation plan for the Western Snowy Plover on the coast in partnership with partner agencies like the U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, along with many other duties. And by no means am I the expert, but I was actually talking about plovers for 5 minutes, so I will do that. So the Western Snowy Plover is a small shorebird, about yay size, lives and nests on Pacific Coast beaches. Historically, it was found along the whole West Coast. All West Coast sandy beaches typically would have Western Snowy Plovers living on them. It is now both a federally and state endangered species in Oregon. The population was down to only a few dozen in the early 90s, but recovery is happening here on the West Coast. The population is expanding well beyond the few dozen of the early 90s up into, I think last year was 600 something birds. This year it's sort of a rocky start, but we'll see. Hopefully, fingers crossed, this good weather is going to improve their status this year. So the population is expanding beyond their core population that was, sort of contracted to the South Coast. So now they're spreading up and down the coast. They came back to the North Coast sites for the first time in 30 plus years in the late 2000s, 2018, 2019. We had them showing up at our snowy plover management areas at Sitka Sedge, Nehalem Bay, Fort Stevens, and lots of road plovers all up and down the coast in our non-designated sites. Plovers are subject to a trifecta of threats: predation, disturbance, and habitat loss. Those are their three primary threats. But today we're focused in this brief time just on the habitat piece, knowing that they're all critically linked to the success of the plover, because the more habitat plovers have, the less they're impacted by those other threats. More dry sand beach, more beach for them to hide from predators, more space to share the beach with people, more room for recreation. So more dry sand beach, the better for the plover. Hence, I'm talking about messing with it. Sorry, Meg. So this is a checklist for plover nesting. They prefer open, generally flat, dry, sandy beaches. The more space, the better. They don't mind some sparse vegetation, some small amounts of woody debris, but the current situation at Nehalem Bay, if you've been there down by the jetty, like that amount of woody debris is not good for plovers. They can't nest in that kind of situation. Their strategy is camo, so they need space to hide from predators and, like I said, to share the beach with humans. So generally flat-ish dry sandy beach is their primary nesting habitat. Oh, anybody? I already hit it, so maybe nobody was paying attention. Can anybody, besides Cheryl, can anybody see the plover nest? And said picture, you all have one right by you. So anybody find the plover nest? No cheating if you saw the pink circle. Anybody? I don't have that much time, so. Anybody want to make a guess where the plover nest is on here? Raise your hand. No? Cheryl, you're cheating. I'm not, you're not allowed. Sorry. Yep, it is right there. So they do it when they have the space, they do a really good job at camo. So if you're out there and you're like, I'll just avoid the plover nest, good luck. Like, I mean, you can be a plover expert and they're like, all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, there's the nest right by my feet. So they do a really good job hiding their eggs. Sorry. So that's what a plover nest looks like. They do not have like a nest bowl. They just like, they do a little bit of like scraping and then just lay their eggs there on the sand. So I think other people already told the story pretty well, but over time, the beach has narrowed at leaving the plovers. I'm used to screen like here, like pointing. I'm like, where's the pointing over there? So that is what in most cases, in a lot of places, including some of our designated plover areas, what they're left with. And that at high tide is where everything else is, where all the people are on that little narrow little strip. So they like dry, open, flat beaches, but most of our beaches aren't like that anymore. Oh, 1 minute. Okay. So they need flat areas. You can sort of see, can you see the plover chicks here? There's plover chicks. Even like really, that's not a very big dune. So they don't do well with big dunes. This is like a little hummock, basically. Think toothpicks with cotton balls attached to them. That's what they look like. They're very small. So we're trying to bring the wide beach back and select areas on the coast, including Clatsop, Spit, Cape Lookout, eventually maybe Nehalem Bay, Sitka Sedge, and Bandon, where we're actively have done habitat restoration. Basically that involves dozing, burying beach grass, trying to flatten it, spraying and repeating. Trying to create more wide open sandy habitat for plovers to nest and ideally recreate that native flatter beach habitat that used to exist before beach grass. But it is an ongoing process and very challenging. Thank you.
Anyone have any questions for Laurel?
Sure. So our commitment in the HCP is those 5 sites. There are other sites that are managed by the federal agencies. So those are the ones we committed to restoring at Bandon, Sitka Sedge, Fort Stevens, Nehalem, and I said maybe Cape Lookout is one of those sites. They haven't nested there yet. They have showed up there this year, but there's no nesting. We had somebody check it out last week, I think. So if they do show up at Cape Lookout, we will start actively managing that, and eventually, maybe there's already some great habitat out there. So not OPRD as far as a commitment to new sites, but yeah, it's a good question.
Thanks, Laurel.
Yeah.
Okay, so next up we have Ian Silvernail from the USDA. So microphone and.
This is the microphone. Okay. Awesome. All right. Hey, folks. So I'm Ian Silvernail. I work for the NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, housed under the USDA. And I work at the Corvallis Plant Materials Center. So we're one of a bunch of these centers in the US that the focus is on a number of things related to supporting NRCS conservation programs, which are things that occur mostly on private agricultural lands. But sometimes we get to work on fun, exciting native plant development kinds of projects. And that's exactly what this is. I love this stuff. It's very exciting to me. So the way that we're trying to support the work that many of you all are doing is by taking a look at the suite of native dune plants that are out there and trying to figure out what we can do to develop an understanding of how to work with those plants in restoration, and then how to support the development of essentially getting this information into the hands of those who can make seeds and can make container plants so that we can have essentially a supported industry for native plants in dune ecosystems. So the background on this briefly is that there's next to zero commercial availability of native plants for dune ecosystems. Lamus mollis, the primary native grass, is our main exception to this. If we look at sort of adjacent plant communities and plants that cross over between dunes and more inland environments, such as yarrow, pearly everlasting, there are examples of plants that fit into both of those categories. For the most part, though, if we're looking at essentially that for dune exclusive native plant community, there's really not much commercial availability of that stuff at all. When you look into what we know at this point about how to germinate, how to grow container plants, how to farm those plants for seed, there's really not a whole lot out there. There's lots of people doing great work, trying things here and there on restoration sites and learning bits and pieces in that environment. As far as a sort of step back and create a broad view of how to develop plant materials from a community-wide perspective for dune restoration, a lot of that knowledge is lacking. And then when you go to that next step of, well, then how do you take container plants like this, seed that have been produced, that's been produced on a seed farm, and put that into a restored dune environment and be successful with plant establishment to meet your goals? That's a whole nother body of knowledge that we as a community need support in developing. So that's part of this project that we're trying to work on. So this is the basic process. And this is being launched upon with a handful of you in the room who we're working with to essentially identify a list of native plants that make sense to emphasize for this development process. And that first step is really identifying that list. So not so much botanically identifying the plants, although that of course is a part of it, but making that list that we think are things that will be functional in a restoration environment. And not all native plants are created equal in that sense. Some need way more babying to make them successful in restoration, and others are set up to be awesome performers. So identifying those species and populations, locations for collecting wild seed, and propagules for plants that may not be seed focused in the way that they reproduce. And there are several examples of that on the dunes. Taking that information, or taking those plants, the propagules, the seeds, next step, at least with the seeds, is figuring out germination requirements, just the basics of how to make that seed work. And there's a lot of funky requirements for a lot of the dune species. Many, as you may not be surprised, require really significant intensive mechanical scarification to break down a seed coat to get them to germinate. Makes sense based on where they live. Then taking that into container production, seeds that germinate from those trials, grow container plants of them. Here's some examples of those. I'd encourage folks during breaks to come up, check them out, learn some of the plants if you're not familiar with them, test yourself. And then we take that to the next step of, we have container plants. Well, what about farming for seed? Can we farm these plants in agricultural soils, which are pretty different than the dune, in order to be able to increase seed so that we take handfuls of seed and make tens of pounds of seed or hundreds of pounds of seed, depending on the species, to then have that available for restoration. And then the next stage that we are dabbling in, but hope to have a more significant study on over the course of the next couple of years, is taking all those plant materials, seeds and container plants, and putting them into multiple sites and tracking that success. What are our species that establish well? What are the methods of introduction, seed or container plant or other kinds of propagules that work well? And then refining as we go forward. This is certainly not a one-shot deal. We have to do these kinds of projects many times in order to best understand how to use plant materials for restoration effectively. Last thing to say is that the emphasis is on more or less about 25 different native species. Corvallis PMC has experience working with about a dozen additional species that cross over into different habitats. So put those together, 35 plus 37 or so species that we're hoping to have a broad view of how to create materials and how to utilize them in restoration. So we have container production underway, some experimental seed production fields underway, and are hoping that within about 2 years, we'll have enough plant materials and enough of a background understanding of how to produce those materials to then initiate on the ground that restoration effort with that suite of materials to better understand how to use them. In active conversation with state parks and NOL to make that something that is successful and hopefully something we can do in a few spots so that we can gather more information. And lastly, that's my email address. Let me know if you want to chat about this. I love this topic and am always available. And if people have specific experiences with specific native plants and their propagation, I'd love to hear that to help facilitate the process.
We have a question. Ian, you have to come up here to answer questions. We have a question for Ian while we're switching to the next.
Beginning, the idea is done commercially at some point.
Yeah.
Is that, I mean, that's after this 24, 25 time, I assume.
Sure. So the goal is to assemble information about how to work with the plants, right? And so working with the federal government, we get to basically take the risk out of it for the private sector, or more of the risk out of it, right? There's always risk in it. Assemble information and get that into the hands of people who do this kind of work. And so there's not necessarily an automatic process for that to happen. The goal is to assemble the information and then contact native plant nurseries and native seed growers and say, what do you think about this suite of plants? Here's the way that you can grow these, and here's who they get into the hands of. So that's a community project, but we'll be supporting the process of getting the information into those hands. That was a slide I had to cut out because I blabbed way too long.
Okay.
So yeah,
No, that's
on to
good.
the next.
Okay. Thank you, Ian. All right, so next we have Armin from the Forest Service.
Ian, I could not ask for a better lead in.
So you can click the
yeah.
arrow and that's a microphone.
Okay, so it's it's just click to advance.
That's right, yeah.
Yep. Very good. Yeah, thanks, Ian. What a great lead into my part of this picture. My name's Armin Rudishki. I work for the Siuslaw National Forest. I'm a restoration botanist, and I am charged with dunes restoration on the Central Oregon coast. And we'll get going here. That would do it. Yep. Okay. So we've been losing our dunes since the planting of beach grass and brooms and the advancement and succession of other vegetation. I think we're seeing different variations of this kind of picture a lot. I think folks understand that. This is at the Deus Overlook, south of Florence, and you can see the same old tree island there, and yeah, significant deflation plain vegetation. So May of 2020, we finished up our environmental analysis for dunes restoration and signed a decision record. It actually authorized about 14,000 acres, but about 2,000 acres were mapped as marten habitat or soon to be Pacific marten habitat. And so for protection measures to not adversely impact a marten and its habitat, that dropped to about 12,000 effective acres where we can do restoration. We do a lot of foredunes activities, primarily for plover habitat management, where we've piggybacked some of our native plant restoration activities with and in the plover areas. A little bit of a different ball game is restoration on the inland dunes where the sand is blown, up to a mile or so inland. And it's a mix of motorized recreation and also non-motorized recreation where we have some really nice, intact native plant communities. And those are our protect the best areas where we want to protect these special habitats and the associated plants and wildlife. Our treatments include bulldozing. Bulldozing is, we've seen quite a bit of that. That scrapes off the beach grass and shapes the foredune into viable habitat for the plovers. Beach grass sprouts and thickens rapidly. That picture on the right is certainly no more than 2 years after a bulldozing event. It sprouts up, and so instead of having to bulldoze every couple of years, which is slow and expensive, we're following with some herbicide treatments, generally a 1% imazapyr dilution, and it's proven to be pretty effective. But being in the weed control business, it takes persistence, ongoing persistence. Inland, we also do some cutting and piling of vegetation. The biggest herbicide application tool we use is backpack sprayers. So often there are native plants mixed in with this, and we do the best we can to only target the invasive beach grass or other non-native invasives. Okay, we talked about the foredune treatments. We've been working with Institute of Applied Ecology for decades, and we collect pink sand verbena seed from down south and spread it out into the plover areas, and we're seeing really good results with that. Let's see, I got to skate through this fairly quickly. One thing that I'm seeing, some of the anecdotal information I'm getting from restoration is, I'm just getting started on this, and it's kind of a field of dreams. If we get rid of those invasives, the natives will come. And on the left there, you can see a little mini explosion of beach evening primrose. Doesn't speak to the reproductivity or survivorship, but it's some promising results, and looking forward to working with Ian to expand the revegetation. Inland dunes, we go after gorse and such, some dead gorse, monitor your contracts. Don't really have time for dune adaptations, but we've done a little bit of collecting and planting out at the Ona Nursery of a few different species. And we also want to work with tribes we got yellow sand verbena is an important cultural species, and dune mat lupin, and what we hope that more of our dunes will look like. The place on the right is Gellenbach Trail. It's a nice native plant dune. Pardon if I went over. Any questions?
Okay, Pro 10.
Can I use the point?
Yep.
So, hi everybody, my name is Quentin Portforet. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the USU, and today I will present you the experimentation that our research team has set up in order to understand the effect of vegetation on dune morphology, and especially the role between the native and invasive species. So the experimentation takes place at the dune system of Nehalem in the northwest coast of Oregon. In February 2021, the vegetation of the dune system was removed over an area of around 90 by 900 meters, as you can see just here. Then 9 plots of 20 by 10 meters were put in place. 2 of them have no vegetation and are used as control. And in the 7 other, plant species were planted alone or associated with other species. So we can find the native beach grasses with Elymus molus and the Festuca amobia, some non-native beach dune grasses with Ammophila arenaria, Revegetation, and the hybrid between these 2 species. And finally, some native forbs, just here, with Abronia, Lupinus, and Latirus. Then several surveys are carried out on the sites. The local weather conditions are monitored at the weather station at the south of the study sites. We do seasonal vegetation survey in order to monitor the vegetation mortality and cover in the plots. We do multispectral and morphological drone survey in order to monitor the vegetation cover and morphological changes over the entire study area. And finally, high precision morphological survey are carried out bi-monthly with a LiDAR at the level of the plots. So for the following, I will mainly present you the result of the vegetation survival and the morphological evolution in the plots. So this figure represents the vegetation survival for each plot from March 2021 to March 2022, with the greatest value of survival for the hybrids, its parent, and the native beach grass Elymus molus. And we can see that the lowest value are found for the native plots and also for the non-native polyculture, mainly due finally to the high mortality of the transplanted native species. Then if we zoom into the native plot, we can see that the higher density are found for the Elymus and the Festuca, and we also found around 2 seedling frosts per meter square. Then if we go to the morphological evolution, we can assess them with this kind of figure, which represent the elevation differences from February to May 2021, with in red the deposition area, in blue the erosion area, and here in black this is our 9 plots. So during this first period, we can see that all the plots are generally marked by some deposition area of around 15 centimeters, reaching here almost 30 centimeters for the plot number 2 with only Ammophila arenaria. Then from May to September 2021, the morphological evolution remained finally quite limited, with only few deposition of around 10 centimeters, still in the plot number 2. Then from September to December, we can find now some erosion and deposition in some plots of about 20 centimeters, which are mainly due to the strong southern windstorm. And finally, the last period of survey from December to April 2022 shows little changes, except when, again, for the plot number 2, here with some deposition of around 15 centimeters. So after this first year, all the plot vegetation are characterized by an average deposition between 7 and 15 centimeters, reaching almost 30 here for the plot number 2. And the control plots are characterized by the lowest value, with an average deposition of 4 centimeters for the southern, and an average erosion of 4 centimeters for the northern control plots. And finally, if we look at the evolution of the sand volume differences in each plot for the entire study period, we can see that the volume has increased here in all the vegetated plots, but the plot number 2 with only Ammophila arenaria stand out with values twice as high as the other plots. So before concluding, it's important to keep in mind that this is only the beginning of the experimentation, which must continue for several years. But after this first year, we can note that the non-native species, and especially the hybrids, survived better than the native species. Then there are various morphological evolution within the plots, which highlight finally the contrasted response of the species to the sound trapping. And among these species, the Ammophila arenaria seems to capture the sediments better than the other species. And finally, all the data are also intended to be assimilated into an aeolian sediment transport and dune evolution model in order to better characterize the effect of each species on sediment transport. So thanks for your attention.
Any questions? Yeah. You got Laurel? Laurel?
I didn't hear your question, sorry. Yeah, there is one plot. I don't remember the number, but this is the plot where the survival was higher. And there is only hybrid species in this plot. Yeah. Yeah.
All the plants are still a little bit small, so I think we'll be able to see that in the next couple years, but it's still sort of at the beginning of their life.
I think that the issue is that the hybrid had much better survival. So it had 90% survival. And whether or not it would catch up to the European species in terms of sand capture, we don't know. But yeah, there's another issue there, which is that there's kind of a gradient in sand deposition. And the European beach grass is actually capturing more sand because it's receiving it more directly.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
it's in the part of the gradient where there's more sand.
We can talk more about it in the discussions later too. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, let's talk about it. Okay. Thanks so much. Okay, so we have Risa.
Great. Thanks for that lead-in, Clinton. My name is Risa Askers. I'm a graduate student at Oregon State University in Sally Hacker's lab, and I work with this newly discovered beach grass hybrid that we briefly touched on, and I'll be talking about its distribution, abundance, and growth form. As was briefly covered earlier in the day, there's 2 invasive beachgrass species that have been introduced to Pacific Northwest coastal dunes. And these 2 species have differences in their morphology or growth form that lead to differences in the shape of dunes that they produce. Oh, thanks, Megan. So in this graphic made by Sally, you can see that Ammophila arenaria has a more vertical growth form that produces these taller and narrower dunes, and Ammophila breviligulata has a more lateral growth form that produces these shorter and wider dunes. And these 2 species also overlap in their geographic ranges in northern Oregon and southern Washington. In just the last 10 years, folks in my lab group found this new beach grass that they wondered if it was a hybrid for a long time. It had some unusual morphology, like a ligule or thin piece of tissue at the base of its leaves that was intermediate between the other species. And my lab mate, Rebecca Mostow, who's in the audience, has done a bunch of work verifying its identity as a hybrid in a paper that just came out last year. So we know it's out there now, and we are starting to answer questions about where it is and what it means for coastal dunes. And so some of the questions that I'll talk about today and are included in my master's thesis include what's the range and abundance of the hybrid? Where does it grow? Also, how does it grow? What's its growth form and morphology compared to its parents? And then how do those potential growth form differences lead to differences in sand capture? And these three questions will be really important for answering its implications for the shape of dunes that it produces, how well those dunes protect against storms and sea level rise, and then also what that means for species diversity and species conservation, such as Western snowy plover. So first, I'll talk about our preliminary findings with this first question about the hybrid's range and abundance. To answer that, I worked with two students, Hugh Lee and Rose Antaki, shown in this picture. We walked the dunes and looked for new hybrid patches. This is us finding a patch right here. And what we found is that it's really all over. There are about 27 patches we knew about before last summer, and we quadrupled that number. Now we know of over 100 patches that were discovered by us, community scientists, and other researchers. It's also important to note that almost all of the patches we found, except this one at Pacific City, are in areas that are dominated by Ammophila breviligulata and just have these small patches of Ammophila arenaria. And that'll be important for what I'll talk about in just another second. I'll move on to the hybrid's growth form, how it grows compared to its parents. When we measured its traits in the field, we see that the hybrid grows at these really high densities, similar to its parent Ammophila arenaria, denser than Ammophila breviligulata. And the hybrid also grows taller than both of its parents by about 10 centimeters in the field. So it's taller and in some cases denser than its parents. And these two traits, stem density and height, are linked to sand capture. So one of our next questions is, does the hybrid capture more sand than its parents? And we're hoping to answer this in a variety of different ways that we have just started working on. So one way is through my field season. I have these transects that run through the hybrid patches, and we can look at sand accretion in and outside of the hybrid patches. And then, as Quentin just talked about, they have a bunch of data from the Nehalem experiment looking at sand accretion in different experimental plots. So hopefully this question can be answered in a variety of different ways. And all of this taken together suggests that the hybrid could be this major player on the dunes and impact different ecosystem services, so such as coastal protection. So since the hybrid grows much taller and denser than its parent Ammophila breviligulata, and also grows mostly in areas dominated by that species, it could potentially capture more sand and increase dune height in those areas, protecting better against storms and sea level rise, although this conclusion, we're still working on data, but that is a potential. And then as the hybrid spreads and possibly survives better than its parents, it could continue to decrease habitat for certain species, such as the Western snowy plover. So again, like with its parents, there's these trade-offs when we talk about the hybrid and the grasses. And it's really important to me that this work be useful for managers and planners. So I'd love to talk about ways that this research could be used and useful in the workshop portion of this section, or I put my email in the next slide. And I think I'm just about at time, so I want to give a big thank you to everyone who helped, including my funding sources, the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, Oregon Sea Grant, my awesome lab group that are in these pictures up here, and everyone else who gave input on this research at all stages. Thank you.
Any question for Risa? Okay, thanks. Oh, wait, we got one.
Do you know if the hybrid makes viable seeds?
That's a great question. For folks on Zoom, it was, does the hybrid have viable seeds? And in my lab, Rebecca, again, has done a bunch of work with an undergraduate student, Mackenzie Barker, looking at the viability of hybrid seeds. And I believe they counted through hundreds of seeds and found, was it five viable seeds each year. 5 viable seeds in each year. So it seems like the hybrid has low viability and spreads mostly through rhizomes and not seeds.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, can Ali, can the Zoom people hear the video? No. Okay, actually, while I'm fixing this, Armin didn't have a chance to answer any questions. So Armin, do you want to come up here and then? But Armin, do you have to come up here?
Reluctantly, yes. Sure.
What over here?
Oh. Over here, and I guess
Yeah.
at least got to speak into the microphone. Yeah, what?
So Meg Reed from the state said that native plants are, well, Ian confirmed they're unavailable, but they're also difficult to establish. Your perspective on how to compare.
I don't. I'm going to be working with and relying on a lot of Ian's work to figure this out. My part is the on-the-ground restoration, and I don't have plots, but anecdotally, I see, oh, wow, we're getting a really good response from the evening primrose, or a pretty good response with addition of pink Samverbena seed, and a decent response of handfuls of other species. Not seeing a lot of the morning glory. And so I'm also kind of catalog, okay, these ones aren't responding, what's the deal with that? And that's where we start building our knowledge to effectively help with species diversity in these restoration spots.
Thank you, Armin.
Yep.
My name is John Stepanek.
Oral, did you have a quick question?
I didn't have a question, I just had a comment. If anybody wants to do research on what comes back after you bulldoze sand, like we said, it's like just anecdotal information, like I've seen lupin popping up, after we bulldoze. If anybody wants to research that, we have opportunities outside of clover season.
I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate in Dr. Sally Hacker's lab.
See what
I'd be
coming back.
glad to help provide some sites.
Yeah, we have lots of sites. See what comes back without planting after.
Laurel, could I ask you a question
Yeah.
in your talk? You mentioned the, what did you call them? I think vagrant plovers that just show up in random places. Rogues, sorry.
Person this week.
Does that trigger any policy implications when they're found
There's like a long-term answer to your question, and then there's a short-term answer to the question. So the short-term answer to your question is that if plovers nest outside of designated sites that will rove and find like buffer the individual nest while they're nesting, so for like a 1 to 2 month period, depending on when the nest is found. But then I don't know about so.
I think we're ready.
All right, thank you all for being here. My name is John Stepanek. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate in Dr. Sally Hacker's lab here at OSU. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person this week, but I'm still really excited to share my research. And I'm sure many of you are all thinking about dunes in a number of different ways and managing them for ecosystem services like coastal protection, habitat for various animals and plants, and also for recreation. But I'd like to make the case that there's an additional ecosystem service that we should be thinking about, especially in the context of climate change, and that is the potential for these dunes to sequester and store carbon. So over the last couple of years, I have gone to 12 sites in Oregon and Washington and done a total of 47 transects where I've tried to measure the carbon storage in coastal dunes. Most of these dunes are what I'll call unmanaged, which are shown in red, where one or both of the non-native Ammophila species has sort of had free reign for several decades. But there are some sites that are marked in yellow that I've gone to that are habitat restoration areas where a lot of that non-native vegetation has been removed to try to improve habitat for nesting shorebirds. So we have kind of some potential for comparisons here, and I'll get to later. But at each of these transects, we measured the morphology of the dunes. So we walked with an RTK GPS backpack over these transects to get things like the beach width, beach slope, crest elevation, and dune volume, among other things. We also measured the above ground carbon stocks by doing quadrat sampling along the transect to get at the composition and density of vegetation. So what grasses are growing there, how many of them. We also collected samples of those grasses and brought them back to the lab to measure the average biomass and the carbon content in their tissues. And the third piece of data that we collected was the below ground carbon. So we did 1 meter deep sediment cores along the transect at the toe, crest, heel, and back of the dune. And this profile is kind of the result of one of those backpack walks in Pacific City, Oregon. And there are, these points showing where we took the cores at the toe, crest, heel, and back. And at some of these sites, we saw quite a bit of organic matter. So on the left here, you can see there's this really dense network of roots and rhizomes below ground. And on the right, you can see we sometimes cored right through decaying driftwood. So there's huge logs out there that have been in various states of decay for a long time, and they're holding a lot of organic carbon in them. Now, I haven't gotten to very much analysis in my project yet, but I'll share some early results. This is showing just over half of my transects from north to south. And then the y-axis is showing organic kilograms of organic carbon per meter squared of dune. So kind of an average value for each of these transects. Well, you can see that there's quite a bit of variation between sites, that for any given site, the vast majority of carbon is in the below ground biomass and in the sediment itself. And the vegetation that we see above ground is really just the tip of the iceberg. So this carbon density piece is really important. And there's also this component of dune volumes. So again, from north to south, you can see there's a huge variation in dune volume. So for a given density of carbon, if there's only a very small dune to kind of multiply that density by, that's not a lot of carbon. If the dune is huge, there's much higher potential for larger carbon stocks at that site. So I want to talk about implications for management. And no, it's not about fire danger, but I kind of like this graphic for thinking conceptually about potential for carbon storage. And again, I hope to validate sort of this conceptual framework with data once I've done more of my analysis. But sort of broad strokes, thinking that sites that have low vegetation density and biomass and small dune volumes are going to have much lower carbon storage, whereas sites that have higher density of vegetation and higher biomass coupled with larger dune volumes are going to have much higher carbon storage potential. Again, I want to couch all this that like extreme carbon storage is very relative. No matter how big or a dune is or how much grass there is growing, it's not going to have as much carbon as an old growth forest. So this is relative terms, but there's still potential for a lot of carbon storage here. So again, I'll kind of just apply this model conceptually, looking at different management scenarios along the coast. So this is a picture I took at Siltcoos, Oregon, where this is an unmanaged dune covered in a Amophila aran area. And there's really, really dense vegetation back here. It's a very large dune, high volume, and there's a lot of woody vegetation that's starting to encroach. So especially as we look towards the future, there's a pretty high potential for carbon storage. If we move north to Pacific City, this is a very heavily managed dune where there's houses basically right on the beach, and there is regular bulldozing and grading of the sand to kind of lower the elevation of the dune and maintain view sheds. But there's also no vegetation. So the potential for carbon storage here is really, really low. If we continue moving north to Nehalem Bay, Oregon, this is a habitat restoration area primarily for nesting shorebirds, where again, here they have significantly reduced the volume of the dune, but they've replanted with various native flora to try to improve habitat quality. And so still relatively low carbon storage potential, but a little bit higher than what we just saw in Pacific City. And finally, I kind of want to show this as an example of what we might expect in the future. So this is back in Pacific City. This is a picture after king tides in 2021, where there's like a 12-foot scarp from all the erosion that took place on that beach. And we know that with climate change, we're going to see larger waves. We're going to see more erosion. There's going to be sea level rise along a lot of the coast. And so we might expect to see more of these scarped and eroded dunes where all of the organic carbon that might be stored in them is washed out and potentially respired back to the atmosphere. So Again, I hope to kind of validate more of these scenarios with my data once I've had the time to do the analyses. But I hope this is interesting to you all and you're starting to think a little bit about carbon storage potential in your management decisions moving forward. I'd like to thank my advisors, Sally Hacker and also Peter Ruggiero, who've both been incredibly helpful in this project. Also my funding sources, NSF and NOAA. And I am happy to take questions virtually. If you have them, you can always reach out to me and contact me with questions or ideas. Thank you so much. All right, thank you all for being here.
While I'm setting up for this one, I think Sally, maybe you can answer the question. Our next talk is from Do you hear me, Sarah?
Yes, I can barely hear you.
Best way for the room to hear you, so everyone can hear you. So if you want to share your video, I'm just trying to find.
Okay. So I do not have a video or a PowerPoint to share. Just going to, in my 5 minutes, talk about the implementation process and strategies that Tillamook County has taken. So is that okay?
Yes, that sounds. I'm going to share your presence. I didn't mean that video you had. So share your presence so people can see you, and that sounds great. Thank you.
Okay. I did not hear most of that.
It looks great. Keep going.
You guys can hear me. That's all. Great. Okay. So good morning. My name is Sarah Absher. I'm the director of the Tillamook County Department of Community Development and have been managing a lot of the coastal planning work for Tillamook County for the last 12 years. And so today, talking about implementation, Tillamook County has 2 areas with adopted and acknowledged 3 areas with adopted and acknowledged 4D management plans. And the one that falls within unincorporated Tillamook County is a 4D management plan and system along the Pacific City shoreline. And this plan was developed in concert with the community and oceanfront property owners in the mid-90s. It was discovered probably around the late 2000s that there was a lot of 4D grading activity going on that did not necessarily have appropriate permitting. And by 2015, started working with OPRD and DLCD on a strategy to help bring our oceanfront properties back into conformance. And that was a very difficult and tough scenario and situation to work through. Interestingly, a lot of the property owners along the ocean front had continued to own their properties and were part of the development of the Pacific City 4D management plan several years ago. The reason for the resistance was largely in part due to the costs associated with planting and maintaining the 4D system once the grading activities had been completed. There was a nursery, Wilbur Turnick, who many of you in the room may have known or are familiar with him and his efforts with nursery and plantings along the coastline. Mr. Turnick, that nursery was not easily accessible to many people, and they're gone through a family transition during the time where finding plantings were very difficult. Also, the other challenge that we had was getting folks to not grade below the 4 feet above base flood elevation requirement. Largely, the focus of the oceanfront homeowners was just simply to keep that dune down as low as possible so that they can maximize their oceanfront view. The strategy that we implemented to bring these properties back into conformance was to work with OPRD and DLCD. I had several workshops with our elected officials, the county commissioners, so that they were aware of the problems that were happening in Pacific City, and representatives from OPRD and DLCD joined me in those conversations so that we could comprehensively and effectively explain to decision makers how important 4D management and stabilization efforts were. With that, we also had several workshops and community meetings with the community, not only the oceanfront homeowners, but the community as a whole, because as we all know, the 4D system serves as our best natural defense against sea level rise and hazards that expose our communities on the Oregon coast. So what ended up happening ultimately was instead of taking code enforcement action to bring all of these properties back into compliance, through a lot of conversations and finally turning the corner where the anger of a lot of oceanfront homeowners and frustrations started turning more into an acceptance approach, we were able to start working with the homeowners on these permits again. We helped them develop manageable planting plans that remain consistent with Goal 18 and our Pacific City 4D management plan specifications. We looked at funding sources and started looking at ways where we could work with OSU and others on developing new planting strategies and re-examining the 4Dune system within the Pacific City area. And for that, I'd like to thank Peter and Sally for their work and conversations on that. The project idea that we had in mind started losing a little bit of steam, but ultimately our initial goal that we were trying to meet was to get our property owners back into compliance and following that management plan. And that definitely has been achieved in most areas along the Pacific City ocean front. Part of the effectiveness of that conversation that I'm not sure plays a significant role in other communities along the Oregon coast, but I folded in FEMA requirements. I am the county's floodplain administrator and a CFM, and really brought the conversation back around to implications and consequences with flood insurance policies and flood risk if the 4Ds were not reestablished to that 4 feet above base flood elevation. And Christine Shirley, who was the NFIP coordinator for DLCD at the time, helped with those conversations too. And that, anytime you bring up FEMA and flood insurance, people do tend to listen. So that was another really strong strategy moving forward in our efforts to help reestablish a healthy 4Dune. I think one of the other things that has helped and it has shown measurable results so that a lot of our community members are starting to see that the plantings are taking effect. And they're not just using European beach grass for those plantings, but OPRD closed the ability to drive on the beach in Pacific City on the northern end of the stretch between Pacific Avenue, which is where the bridge is, up to Cape Kiwanda, with the exception of the dory boats who park close to the beach, to the Cape, to fish. And so when the driving was prohibited on the beach, we started seeing stabilization efforts flourishing around these properties. And with that, the other thing that we did was we have allowed some temporary fencing measures. So we worked with OPRD, DLCD, and surf riders on a acceptable plan that would allow our property owners to protect their beach grass and their investment, so that ultimately would also promote stabilization. And so where we are today, we are actively pivoting 4D grading activities. I've been working with Meg and prior Jay Senewald on doing inspections and reporting and staying engaged with those oceanfront homeowners and also supporting them in their efforts to maintain their maintenance and monitoring plans and the vegetation by doing things like allowing some sort of temporary fencing or other mechanism signage so that the public is also aware of these stabilization efforts that are underway. So happy to answer any questions, but we were able to take a pretty dire situation in Tillamook County and turn it around. And that was largely in part because of the partnership with state agencies and then the community.
Have any questions? Yeah.
I have a question for Sarah. I'm not sure if you can hear me or you can
There
translate.
is a microphone right there.
Speak loudly, Sarah. You talked about temporary fencing. Is that sand fencing you're talking about?
So, hi, is that Peter?
Yes, it is. Hi.
Peter. I can't see you, but I can hear you. It's nice. It's nice to hear you. So we actually worked on some temporary, like wooden stakes or posts that twine or rope could either be threaded through or wrapped around to protect those areas. But everything is so a lot of staking, but it's all movable. And the stipulation for that is that it has to be removed once it has been determined that the area has been stabilized.
Great. Thank you very much.
And that did not, and to add to that, one of the things that we talked about was making sure that the public access to the beach was not limited or prevented with these efforts.
Thanks. Thank you. I think she can hear you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
Next up, we have Carly.
Okay, Zoom, can you hear us again? Yes, okay, yes, great. Okay. You have to go to the next slide. Yep. There we go. Hi, everyone. My name is Carly Ringer. I'm a graduate student at Oregon State, and I work with Megan. And today I'll be talking about some initial findings about differences in managed and unmanaged dune morphology. So this is a brief, overview of what Meg and Kevin already talked about. But in Oregon, there are 6 official 4 dune management plans, and all of these plans, must comply with the regulations established by Goal 18. But the actual implementations and the grading and replanting requirements are varied among the plans, and that's dependent on the actual physical location and how these plans came about. So, for example, like Meg mentioned, in Cannon Beach, view grading is no longer permitted, but that is permitted in other plans. And additionally, the recommendations for stabilization with vegetation, those requirements and recommendations vary. Most of them recommend the use of the European beach grass, and some do recommend a combination of European beach grass and the native to Oregon American dune grass. And for the rest of this talk, I'll be focusing on Pacific City. And I have some questions that are guiding my thesis research. So we know that dunes are important. We've been hearing about that all day. They have a lot of ecosystem services, provide coastal protection and habitat. But they're also managed for different reasons and different purposes. So I'm interested in how these management activities affect dunes long term. So the fundamental questions I have are, how does dune morphology change after grading events? And what are the effects of dune management practices on long-term dune evolution? And to begin to answer these questions, we've been collecting data at Pacific City with GPS backpacks since 2018. And we're gonna look at some results from that data. And I've picked out these 3 transects. We've got 2 managed transects and an unmanaged transect, they go through an unmanaged and 2 managed areas. So if we're looking at these plots, we've got the blue lines, which in some of them they're hard to see, but that's from the initial survey in August of 2018, and the gradient goes up to red to our survey that was literally a week and a half ago. So we're collecting this data, it's ongoing, but this is what we're seeing so far. So in Pacific City, we know that extensive grading has taken place for decades. And on the right, you can see this very flat, unvegetated, smooth surface of the dune with some vegetation planted on the foreslope. And in contrast, just north of that area, we have really tall, heavily vegetated with European beach grass. And that makes Pacific City a really interesting place to look at the differences in morphology between these types of dunes. And another thing that we see in these plots and in this data are actual grading events. So this is in another managed area in the more southern end of Pacific City. But on the plot, on this graph, we can see that sometime between fall of 2020 and our next survey in the winter of 2021, this area was graded. So I can assume from looking at these profiles that happened. But to get a better idea, I've inspected aerial satellite imagery. This is just from Google Earth, but we can actually see that this grading event did take place. And this gives us, more information about what the area looked like and what it looks like now. And we also get that information from going out to these sites and collecting the data. So some preliminary results. I took this data, and from our initial survey in 2018 in August, I picked the initial dune crest, so the highest point on that transect, and I tracked that point, that cross-shore position's elevation through time. So on the left, I'm just showing the profiles again with the dashed line is our initial dune crest cross-shore position, and then on the right, this plot is showing that change in elevation over time, and this is meters. And our reference is approximately the mean low water line. So a couple of things, again, this is preliminary. We have a lot more data to collect and a lot more metrics to look at, but we can see that this unmanaged dune appears less variable over time in this elevation metric. And on the other hand, in these managed areas, there is more variation in this elevation of the dune. And one really great thing that I'm excited about for this is we can pick up these grading events. So we can get a history, both with, actual our understanding of what happened in these areas. We can look at our data and see, okay, we see that this grading event happened. And then we can track the morphology since that grading event. And that's what I'm interested in, seeing what happens to these dunes after they're graded. So what's next for me? We've got topography data at all of these sites. The 6 communities with management plans. So analyzing that data would be great. And then also, like I've been talking about, exploring the area's dune management history to understand what's been going on and what's continuing forward. And also incorporating vegetation data into our understanding of how this ecosystem is working and how the plants are affecting the morphology. And thanks to my funding sources, and this is a picture of me and Risa and another student collecting data, and it's been great. And I'd love to talk about this with people who are, implementing these plans and making it happen. So thank you. Any questions for Carly? Yeah.
Okay, it's probably obvious, but the change graph. So the managed dunes, we're seeing sand flowing out, sand depositing, sand flowing out.
Yeah, so let's go back to, yeah. So when we look at this elevation change, I think so the unmanaged dune, the red plot, this is a very stable, established foredune. And the other one, so the blue plot, the blue transects, this was a lower in elevation dune that I think sees more variability in vegetation and sand capture in this survey time period. So that's where we're seeing this up and down of the elevation. But you can see after this grading event, at least the 3 surveys after that, there is minimal change since then. Thank you, Carly. Okay, last lightning talk is from me. I realized at the beginning I never actually introduced myself. Lots of things going on. So I'm Megan Wengrove. I'm an assistant professor at OSU. You've all been receiving emails from me. I'm actually in the College of Engineering, but I focus most of my research on coastal engineering. And one of these projects is on dunes. But this talk is focused on coastal engineering with nature, what it is, and what types of strategies we have on the outer coast. So the engineering with nature concept was kind of coined by different agencies. This is the Army Corps' definition. It's using natural processes for maximum benefit. If we can use Mother Nature's engine to accomplish our engineering objectives, we should make use of that opportunity. And then also broadening the range of benefits provided by a project. So while a project may be intended for a specific purpose, most, if not all, projects have multi purposes. And so if we can use those different benefits to advance the projects, then we should. So I like these kind of motivations for why investment in natural infrastructure is important. So the coastal ecosystem services are valued at $492,907 per hectare of coastline per year. And we can think 1 mile has the 1 square mile, like the side of it is about 16 hectares. So you can think about how many hectares there are in Oregon. I think Meg had 362 miles of coastline. Additionally, big storm events cost upwards of $100 billion in repairs for the US. And natural coastal infrastructure is estimated to provide $26.6 billion in storm protection services. And in Oregon, Goal 18 limits the type of infrastructure that can be implemented on the outer coast. So if we have softer solutions like natural infrastructure, that might be a way that we can move forward. So we've been talking a lot about dunes and grading dunes and planting vegetation. So I'm not going to talk more about that. That's one option. Another option is beneficial placement of dredge sediments. So the Army Corps, the US Army Corps in Oregon, Portland District is experimenting with taking dredge sediments that are coming out of rivers for navigation and placing them in the near shore with the idea that the waves and the currents can naturally push the sand up towards the coast and basically re-nourish the coast. So instead of putting these dredge spoils far offshore, placing them somewhere that could be potentially useful is one potential option that is under investigation right now for the Pacific Northwest. Another is dynamic revetments. So there's a lot of interest in dynamic revetments right now, and David Cottrell is here in the audience, and he could tell us about his experiments he's been doing in Washington. So a dynamic revetment is where you place cobble on the coast, and the cobble naturally moves around, and there's evidence that it kind of dampens wave energy, but also traps sand, especially if you have a gradation in cobble sizes. So this could be implemented as a way to protect the shoreline from eroding, and then with the dune behind could include elevation for protecting for those high water level events. So there's going to be a lot of research on this going forward, many different projects just at OSU. And then the next option is reinforced dunes. So there's a way to do this without really hard structures, putting sand in bags, or something called biocementation. So this is where you actually use naturally occurring microbes that already exist in the sand, and then you feed them. You can put more microbes in, and when you feed them, they actually cement the sand together, kind of like sandstone. So it creates, cements the different sand grains together. This picture on the left is showing the red is the sand grains, the blue is water and the yellow is all the cementation in between. And you can see a microscopic image on the right of that. And so the idea is that you could not play the video or the sound, but you could take this into a like put it on a mat inside the dune, put it on the surface, it's like a surface treatment on the dune, or as a core inside of the dune itself. And the cool thing about it is there's still a lot to learn about how it affects coastal processes. The cool thing about it is that you could, or when it is eroded by the waves, it will roll around on the beach and eventually turn back into sand. So you're not putting like concrete on the coast or extra rocks. So biocementation is another option. Okay, and that was my quick, these are other alternatives for coastal protection that are more focused in the natural realm. These are a bunch of grad students who helped us in the project in Nehalem. We had over 50 volunteers for that project and still ongoing. So thanks so much. Okay. I can answer a quick question. Yeah.
How do plants grow within the biosphere?
It's a good question. Yeah, so the question was, how do the plants grow within the biocementation? So there's geotechnical engineers at North Carolina State who are working on that right now, and they've found that specific grasses are able to grow with lightly treated surface treatment, and then other grasses have not been able to grow. So there's still a lot to learn about how vegetation and biocementation would work together, but it seems like there could be some avenues. Yeah, it's a good question. Okay, yeah.
The 492, roughly $500,000. The unit on that is per acre or per hectare?
Hectare. Sorry, I said the word wrong. Per hectare is the $400,000 metric.
$500,000 per hectare.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Well, thanks for a successful morning session.